So when we look at reading 2, what we're looking at here is questions that ask some of the kind of weird details about what type of passage something is, or what an author's purpose is. And there's 2 different kind of avenues that they use for this. So we'll discuss both of them. So in reading 1, which I don't think I have offered this week, I should have it offered next week if you never have taken reading 1. One of the things that we talk about in reading 1 is how we kind of break down the paragraphs and understand more of what the passage is accomplishing. With or without that skill, you will enhance that skill by using purpose. But whenever we read something, in addition, once you've completed all your reading classes, in addition to all of the things that you learn from all those reading classes that you should always do, another thing that you should always do is think about the purpose. So ultimately, when you finish reading something, the first question you should ask yourself is, what did the author really set out to say, or why did they really end up writing this particular article? And that would be the author's purpose. The author's purpose is something that you'll get asked about often. And it's also something that's really, really important to a lot of questions, that's not what they ask. But that having an understanding of what the author's purpose is pretty much paramount to being able to answer the question. So a habit that you want to start to get into as you're practicing your packets for all of the different reading classes is making sure that as soon as you finish reading something, the first thing that you establish for yourself is, what is ultimately the author's purpose? Why did they set out to write this? And what did they primarily want to convey? So obviously your purpose will often be connected to your main idea quite a bit, but it may go a little bit beyond the main idea. So the main idea is just the main point more so. The purpose might have a bit more to it in the sense of, why did they set out to write it in general? So to give you an example, there's an article that's in one of my packets, and it basically is about how the elderly are at a tremendous risk of falling and how high the injury risk is if they do fall. So the main idea for that passage is the fact that elderly are at a tremendous risk of falling and a tremendous risk of injury if they do fall. The purpose is very close to that. So the author is mainly trying to convey the things that I just said when I described the main idea. But the reason that the author is trying to convey it goes a little bit further, and it goes into a slightly more human direction, which is to hopefully prevent someone from actually going through this by explaining it and by talking about it and by outlining what the risk is. This author hopes that they'll run into somebody who either is elderly or interacts with the elderly, or has an elderly family member, and maybe some of the things that are in this article could actually prevent one person from falling. So that's the slightly more human purpose. So we should always think about purpose, and there are definitely several times where we will get asked about purpose in that exact way. So what did the author set out to say? What was their main thing that they were trying to convey, and how were they trying to convey it? When we get to the how piece of how they were trying to convey it, that question may also contain a passage type. So some of your purpose questions will be very simple, and they'll essentially just say, what was the author's purpose, and have you explain it. Their purpose was to say this, or their purpose was to, convey that, or whatever. However, some of your purpose questions will say something like to inform, to explain, to tell a story, or to entertain, to express feelings, or to persuade. These require a little bit more study. So if you ever have taken the test before, you have seen these. Most likely they are something that you remember having a bit of an issue with because you weren't exactly sure what the author's point was, or what type of passage would best describe what their point was. And we want to clarify that and then practice a lot of that intermixed with a lot of our other purpose questions. So the main things that you're going to encounter are going to be informative, narrative, and persuasive. So those would be the three, if I were to pick three that you are definitely going to encounter more often than anything else, these would be the three that I would pick. So informative's purpose is to inform. You'll notice that there's two taglines with each of these. So there's an actual passage style like informative, expository, technical, narrative, expressive, persuasive. You may actually see an answer choice that's how you answer it. You also might see more of the tagline, which will say to inform, to explain, to tell a story, or to entertain, to express feelings, and to persuade. So you could see it in either format. They essentially mean the same thing. It's just two different ways of describing the same thing. You may notice that there's differences in wording of the questions, and they kind of correlate to the differences in how the answers are worded. You don't really need to worry into that much detail. You don't really need to think that far. So if we think about informative, we're thinking about something that is the entire major intent in this passage is to inform us. So to inform us is to give us good information to where we can kind of make our own conclusion about something. So it's providing us with information. It's usually either in a chronological or more likely in some type of logical order. So they'll discuss certain aspects of a topic and they will be informing you of these different aspects. It will provide details and it will leave room for essentially the reader to get their own idea or make their own opinion. So it's just information for you to make you informed about a particular thing. We're not going to talk about expository for a couple of minutes here. We'll come back to expository. A technical, you will run into a technical here and there. Technicals would be anything that's like really obviously technical, like a chart, a graph, a map, phone book pages that have headers that you're supposed to find something in. Anything that's not in a paragraph type format will definitely be technical. Usually they don't ask you for the passage type on those because I guess they figure it would be obvious to you that it's technical. So instead, usually where you'll see a technical is when they give specific instructions. So we'll run into a couple of technicals today. And they are usually when a specific type of instruction is being given. So if you want to do this, then here's the steps that you follow. If you want this type of outcome, then here's the steps that you should take. So it's a very specific set of instructions or commands, or any of the things that would be very obviously technical, like charts, graphs, tables, etc. A narrative, you'll run into one, maybe two narratives on the average test. A narrative's purpose is to tell a story. You usually won't see that one if you're actually answering it that way. You'll usually see to entertain. So if you're going to say something is entertaining, it must be a story. So if at any point in time you answer that something's purpose is to entertain, you'll want to remember that entertain is attached right here to telling a story. So even if something is entertaining, but it's ultimately informative or it's ultimately persuasive and it's not actually a story, you will not want to say its purpose is to entertain. So a story will be fairly obvious. A story has to be in chronological order 99% of the time. It has to be this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It's told as a story, so it'll have events. It'll have characters. So characters, events, it'll be in order, and it will read as what you would think of as a story. So rather than having a paragraph about one aspect of a topic and a paragraph about another aspect of a topic, which would be informative, it will tell a story from beginning to middle to end. Similar to a narrative is an expressive. And an expressive's whole purpose is to express feelings. Expressives will use a story most typically in order to get those feelings across. However, the story will be for the entire purpose of feelings. So there will be a story present, but it's there to show the feelings. So to decide between an expressive and a narrative is usually an easy decision to make. But the thing you have to figure out is the events and the characters and the story there to set up these feelings, or are we more focused on the events and the characters and the stories and not so focused on the feelings? There's usually a pretty obvious difference. So expressives tend to be something fairly extreme, like one of the expressives that I've seen is a story about a kid who, when he was 8 or 9 years old, his mom told him to go check on the elderly neighbor before he went fishing, and he didn't, but he said he did, and a couple was found to have had a heart attack and died in her house. So that was a very obvious, even though there was a bit of a story to it, it was very obviously to express the feelings of sorrow and guilt and things like that that came with that, rather than it was to tell the story of how it happened. So those are usually pretty obvious. You will only see maybe one expressive. You typically will only see one narrative. And if you do see an expressive, because you may not, you would typically see one expressive also. So an expressive is a story that's there as a vehicle to show how someone felt. And then the last one is probably the most obvious to most of us, which is a persuasive. A persuasive can be called an argumentative, and I really only put that on there because you might have heard it said that way in the past. But it's always going to be referred to as a persuasive within the context of the test. When we think about a persuasive, we're thinking about something that is there to persuade us. So remember, in all of these, and the most common mistake people make is they try to look at these as a style, as a passage style, instead of looking at these as a purpose. So remember that when you go to answer any of these, the thing that you need to be able to answer is what is its purpose, not what is it, but what is its purpose. So how that relates to persuasive is there could be persuasive elements in a lot of different things, but the intent may not be to persuade. So they only may be persuading for a couple of minutes, and mostly they're just telling a story or they're just executing something. And that's yours to figure out. So how to decide if it's persuasive or if it's mostly informative, but maybe got persuasive for a couple of seconds at some point, is when you think about purpose. This all takes practice, but it also takes having a bit more of an outline than you probably do prior to this discussion, in knowing how you would find the indicators for these different things. So let's take out some of the things that we've talked about that are kind of obvious. So in order to have an expressive, you may have characters and you may have events, and it may be a little bit of a story, but it's very focused on the feelings that are involved as a response to the story. You're only going to see one, maybe even zero of those. Narrative is to tell a story, and to tell a story is synonymous with to entertain. So the most important point I can make about narrative or telling a story is if you're going to say that a purpose of something is to entertain, it has to be an actual story. And I'll give you an example for that. There was a time not all that long ago that I was taking the TEAS, and I saw a little passage, maybe 2 short paragraphs about this particular type of cat. And so this author's describing this particular type of cat and the behaviors that it has. And he's talking about it being like kind of a skilled cat in comparison to other cats. It can do these certain things that are pretty advanced. And the author clearly liked these cats, and the tone that the author was using was very favorable toward the cats. And when it asked me for purpose, I almost said to entertain. I was like, well, I was entertained by this description of these cats. And then I thought back to the tagline that you're supposed to think back to, which is Is it a story? So if I'm going to say it's to entertain, I'm also having to say that it's a story. Well, in this case, it wasn't. It was informative. It was telling me about this type of cat. It just so happened that the author had a favorable opinion of the cat. So the only thing that could ever possibly trip you up on narrative is if you weren't paying attention and you said something was narrative that actually wasn't, and that would be because of the entertain. So that gets rid of those two. We can also get rid of technical. So technical is going to be anything that's obviously not a passage form of something. So it's not in paragraph form, as well as some things that are in paragraph form but are giving some type of specific information or specific instruction. Very data oriented rather than being descriptive. They don't sound terribly human. They sound very descriptive and very bland in terms of the data. That leaves us with the main three, and I'm going to switch colors and circle the main three. So the main three, in terms of what you could actually get a little bit confused on even after having completed this outline. So now you should feel pretty comfortable with identifying a technical, a narrative, and an expressive. You should currently at this very moment feel a bit more comfortable with identifying an informative or a persuasive, but it gets a little bit closer here. So it's pretty easy to tell if something is a story, and it's pretty easy to tell if something is designed for expressing feelings. And it's pretty easy to see if something is not really written in a human way as much as data-driven. It's much harder to tell the difference between an informative, an expository, and a persuasive. Starting with persuasive, I'll kind of reiterate what I just said about persuasive a couple minutes ago. So persuasives are essentially, they have to have an entire purpose. They have to essentially have been made in the first place to convince you of something. So even if there's moments where you can see that the author has a particular opinion, or you can see that the author's tone is favorable or not favorable towards something, even if there's a moment where they're very, very persuasive, the entire article, everything that's involved in whatever it is you're reading, has to have been intended to convince you of a particular perspective. If that's not the case, then you may have an informative that's got a slightly persuasive element. Luckily, your choices won't come down really, really close like this very often. Once in a while they will, but usually they won't. So typically you're going to know whether something's persuasive or not. If you happen to get that one darn passage that's really close and it's really hard to make that call, then what you would probably want to think of is, do I feel like the author wrote this for the sake of convincing me? Or do I feel like they wrote this to inform me, but maybe I can kind of see what they think? And that will make the final call on persuasive. That takes us down to these final two up at the top. Here's the thing, and I've changed this quite remarkably in the last few years. I no longer really explain what an expository is, no pun intended, because expositories explain. And I don't really want you to know what they are. Not to mention, expositories have this really annoying element to them where everyone defines them differently. I've seen like 6 or 7 different definitions for expository, which is one of the many reasons that I tell you guys to stay away from books that say they're about the TEAS. In all of those books that I regularly hear you guys say that you have, expository is defined remarkably differently in each of them. So that's not a good situation. Here's the thing. An expository is ultimately, if you use my favorite definition of it, the one that I think is most applicable in the most circumstances, it's essentially something that explains a little bit more than an informative. So it's a little more detailed. It would use a slightly more narrow scope. So instead of discussing a lot of big aspects of a topic, it would pick one of those big aspects and really zone in and analyze it. So some people say they're very analytical. Some people say they're not that analytical, but they're very explanatory. Some people say that they have less of a human tone than an informative. Like I said, there's a bazillion ways to think of them. If you think of an expository as being to explain, and you think of an informative as being to inform, then essentially they're the same thing. And the reason that I'm telling you that they're essentially the same thing is you're never going to read something and think, oh, that's an expository. That's definitely an expository. You would never think that, because there's not enough difference between informative and expository for that to happen. So when you read an expository, you're not going to detect that it's expository. You're going to be like, that's informative, or it's that other one. What's that other one? Expository. So you're not going to see a difference between the two. Basically, everything that you read that doesn't fit in one of the categories that we already discussed and crossed out is either informative or expository. Generally speaking, it's informative. You're not going to read an expository and immediately recognize it as being an expository. You're going to read an informative and you're going to say that's to inform. So why do we care what expository is? Even though the only ones that you will read on the test would be informative, sometimes they choose not to put informative there. So sometimes they just don't put informative. It is an informative. You read it and you're like, yep, that's definitely informative. You go to look at your answers and it's not there. That's when we pick expository. So it's the backup of informative. That's all it is. We don't actually read something and think, oh, that's definitely expository. It would be impossible to do that. It's impossible to really discern between expository and informative. If you did discern between them, it would be your opinion. You might read something and think informative. I might read it and think expository. The line is too fine. It's coming down to somebody's opinion as to which one is which. So the only time you're going to use expository, and I'm not saying you won't use it, because you will use it. You'll probably use it 3 or 4 times, will be because you wanted informative, but it's not there. Why do they like second best answers on the TEAS? I do not know, but they do. They love second best answers. They do it in anatomy. They do it in biology. They do it all over the place. So this is one of those places that you might find your answer before you actually look at what your choices are, and then not find it in your choices. So expository is very simply the backup. When you think something's informative and then you don't see informative there, it's expository. The only other thing you could ever possibly mix up an informative with is a persuasive. But I think if you thought something was informative, you looked at the choices and it wasn't there, I think if there had been several persuasive elements, you would immediately think of that and go, wait a second, maybe this is persuasive, and you'd go back and kind of think about persuasive. So I don't think you'd stay confused for very long, because you'd kind of have the heads up that it might have been persuasive. So that's going to take some practice. I will point out every time we pick expository, because of the fact informative is not there, I will always point that out. And essentially that's the way I want you to think of it. So what you need to know is you need to know kind of the tagline for each. So informative or to inform, expository or to explain. Get rid of the in detail or step by step. That's really more than what you need to memorize for this. So just cross that out. Just have to explain. If you're OCD like me, you can close your parenthesis with your pen. So expository, to explain. Think of expository and informative as being one and the same. If ever you saw both of them, which is really rare, but if ever they actually had both of those there, you'd always pick informative. You're never going to have a situation where you can say it's expository and not say it's informative. So if you have to pick between the two, it's always going to be informative. They're not going to throw an expository in there. If you think of informative and you can't find it, which will happen all the time, trust me, you'll feel like it happens all the time after today, then you'll pick expository. A technical is something with very specific instructions or something that's represented in a non-written type format, in more of a data format. Narrative would tell a story or entertain. The most important thing about narrative is to remember that if you ever use the tagline to entertain, you are saying it's a story. So make sure that those two things line up before you use that tagline. Expressive would be to express feelings. It doesn't have to have a story in it, but usually it will. And then persuasive is to truly, the entire purpose of the entire thing is truly to convince you of something. So you're going to get asked a lot of questions that use these. You're also going to get a lot of questions off the next couple of pages. On the second page, and I believe the vast majority of the third page, we'll flip to that one in a second, I want you to read these and I want you to know these really, really well. That said, if I were to talk about them in this lecture, I would just essentially read what I have written there, and that would be a pointless use of my lecture time. So you will have to read these. These are TEAS print sources, and they use them all the time. Again, if you've seen the test, you've seen them do this. They'll say, where would you find this? And then you have to pick between encyclopedia, almanac, classified ad, and memo, or whatever. So know the definitions of each of these. These aren't things that we regularly use, depending on what you regularly do and what you regularly interact with. Some of these may be very, very obvious, or none of them might be. All of them that are in this list could absolutely be something that they could expect you to know what it is and then be able to identify something you would use it for. So I'm not going to do that one because I will just end up reading my notes. My notes are written exactly the way you should understand them. There's nothing additional I can really say, but make sure you go back to that and that you do read it and know it. Same type of thing. I put a lot of time and thought into the first half of the next page in addition to that last page. Again, make sure that you know these, but I'm not going to go through them because I'll just end up reading my writing. I literally spent the last hour listening to a physiology lecture for a nurse practitioner student where the instructor literally just read the PowerPoint slides for an hour. And I kept waiting for a little bit of an expansion, a little bit of instruction, nothing. Just read the PowerPoints. I would never do that to you. I will never ever do that to you. So those things I can't elaborate on, but I can help answer questions if you bump into issues with them after you've kind of read them. So if you're unclear on what the difference is between a couple of them or unclear of where you might see one of them, that is something you can send me a message, follow up with me, and I can explain further. I will explain this part down here a little bit. So one of the questions that you'll absolutely get asked at least one time will have to do with the primary versus non-primary source. So that's a really, really important one. There's a few different contexts that they might use for this. A primary source will always mean a direct and original source of information. That's a guarantee. It will always mean that. What a direct and original source of information actually is, that will vary a little bit from one place to another. So let's say that they ask you to figure out what would be a primary source on an individual. I've seen that question on the TEAS 4 or 5 times. They'll give some random person's name. They'll very vaguely explain who they are, and they'll say, how would you find a primary source on this person? So a primary source on a person has to be something that that person wrote themselves. They actually physically wrote it and signed it or whatever. Or maybe you recorded them saying something, which usually doesn't work in the context of what they're talking about. They're usually talking about somebody from the 1950s. So a primary source has to have actually directly came from that person, or it's not primary. Quoting them is not primary, as tempting as that answer might be. That is not a primary source if it's a quote. In the case of something more nonfiction, a great example is the TEAS test, since everybody here is familiar with that idea. The only primary source for the TEAS is the actual board of people who write the TEAS. In the case of the TEAS, it's one person. They actually write the test. So, of course, that's ATI. If it's not ATI, even if it's me, I would be more trustworthy in telling you exactly what to study and how to study than any other human or publisher that I can think of. But I am not a primary source because I am not who writes the actual TEAS test. So it doesn't necessarily indicate the quality of the source, but it does indicate the direction of the source. To be a primary source, you have to be direct from exactly the location. The only primary source for the TEAS is ATI. The only primary source for the HESI is Elsevier, and so on. And then the last one that you might see would be for an event. So a primary source when it comes to an event is an eyewitness to any aspect of the event that is then written about. So you can't have a primary source for an event that doesn't actually make it into the article, but you can have a primary source for any of the things that were witnessed that ended up being in the article. One of the most common passages for you to run into, and I will show it to you a couple of different times in different spots, is about it's kind of a story about a sighting of a UFO, and there's multiple elements to how they tell the story. So at first they say that the UFO was spotted as lights above New Mexico, and a couple of people saw it. And then they say that later in a different place, an old man was abducted or was disappeared after seeing something similar. And then they say that a journalist who was trying to do research on this saw a downed ship in like a military base. So those are 3 different eyewitness accounts of something specific that made it into the story. All of them are primary sources. If you know that article or you've seen it with me before, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, the basic premise is if an event was witnessed by a person, and then that same event that was witnessed by that person made it into whatever the story or the article that you're reading is, then that person becomes a primary source for that essay or whatever you're reading. Moving on. Okay, so now we're in our practice stage. If you're fairly new to my classes or you're fairly new to reading classes, we do tons and tons of practice. That's most of how we spend our reading time. So what I would advise is anything that I just lectured over that you're not 100% solid on, which is probably a good part of it because I moved fairly quickly there. Make sure to go back and really get the concepts, and make sure to let me know if any of the concepts are not sticking. You will know a little bit more of what is and isn't sticking for you in particular as we progress through this practice, because you will get asked these very questions that I've been referencing, and you'll be able to see if you end up instinctively answering them right or wrong. So try to factor in the bazillion facts that I just expressed to you in the last 30 minutes as you're doing these different questions. We're going to do this first one. This is a short passage. It's a couple of really short paragraphs. There's 2 questions with it. There will be several questions throughout this packet that are not purpose questions, and there will be several iterations and reiterations throughout the packet that are purpose questions. So you'll see some of both. Anything that we see in here is good practice that I feel goes with purpose. So even if you're getting all of your purpose questions right, but you're missing some of the other things, depending on what they are, that may be an area that you want to check in with me. If something is very specifically from another class, I will point that out. So read these 2 little paragraphs, attempt questions 17 and 18. We will stop there, so I'm going to give enough time that I think everybody made it through those. And then after a couple of minutes, I will tell you what the answers are and why. Hopefully everybody had a chance to get through that one. I will make a strategic recommendation, which of course I'll do several times. We always want to be strategic anywhere that we can. So anywhere we can save time by noticing something in the answer choices or some type of trend, we always want to do. And that's not a particular reading class. That's just kind of practicing as you keep going through them. So what type of writing is this? This one's actually starting off with one of the trickiest passage type questions. This is persuasive. It does help a little bit what they gave you for answer choices, but you still may have picked expository. So this doesn't come across as being overwhelmingly persuasive, although it's definitely centered on someone's opinion about George Washington. It's definitely not a story, so you probably got rid of narrative. It's definitely not technical. And that would leave you with expository and persuasive. Remember, expository actually means informative. The thing is, were you actually informed of anything when you read this? So probably the answer to that is no. There was no actual information. Nothing was explained. It was more of a discussion that was somewhat of an opinionated discussion as to how we should look at history and how we should look at this person from history. It was not so much informing me. Like, I didn't receive any new information. I didn't learn anything from this discussion. And that makes it persuasive because it's his opinion on this issue. On the second question, there's a very interesting kind of way that we can shortcut a little bit. So if we look at the first part of this, and it asks us what accurately represents the historical context of this text, that's not an overly specific question, so you can't just kind of glance at that and see what they mean by it. You kind of are dependent on answer choices. There are questions that you will automatically notice. You have to know what the answers are before you can really even get anywhere. And then there's questions that you'll immediately kind of know what you want to answer to it just by reading the question. This is one of the ones that doesn't really tie to anything. So the first half of each of these answers is actually really telling, and this is my strategic point. So from a strategy standpoint, the first half of this is it answers it, because there's two very different types of statements in each of these halves of each of these answers. But if you look at the first half, it was written during Washington's presidency. Well, definitely not, right? They're talking about him having been president a very long time ago. It also excludes the possibility of having been written right after Washington's presidency. If it was written by a personal friend of Washington, that would actually kind of make it where it had to be during or not too long after his presidency, because somebody wouldn't have lived 100 years beyond him if they were friends with him. So all three of those answers are actually the same. They all say that it happened a very, very, very long time ago. This article was not written a very, very, very long time ago. Even if it was not written anywhere near the lifetime of George Washington. And the key discussion that they're having is the legend of someone, and how does the legend of someone follow them for many, many, many years after their life. So we know it's much later. That leaves us with D purely because we need to say it was much after his lifetime. If you didn't notice that, that's okay. But hopefully you're like, oh, wow, I could have saved myself a ton of work there, because I don't even have to read the second half to know for a fact I'm getting it right. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't read the second half. I would go ahead and read the second half, make sure you're really happy with your answer, confident in your answer. Because of this, the author's main difficulty is deciding whether or not the legend of Washington's deeds has been inflated by the passage of time. That is what the discussion was. You probably don't feel like that was as obvious. And what I've noticed in the distant past, before I taught this the way that I'm teaching it right now, is a lot of people would have trouble answering that question because of the second part. So all of the second sentences are really blurry and confusing. and none of them exactly say what the passage said, to where it leaves you kind of empty. The reason that they get away with that, the reason they wrote those that way, is because the first half of the answer will tell you beyond the shadow of a doubt whether or not it would be correct. So then you realize only D can be correct. At that point, all you have to do is validate the second half of the answer rather than having to really think about it. Does it work? Does it make sense? The next passage is also nice and short, just a couple of paragraphs. This passage has 4 questions about it, 2 of which are purpose, 2 of which are something else. One of them's from another, well, actually both of them are from another class. So read through this couple of paragraphs, attempt these 4 questions. I'll give you plenty of time. Make sure that you're really careful, especially with your purpose ones. This class is primarily focused on purpose. Anything else that you can do well on, of course, you want to do well on. But make sure that on the purpose ones, you're really slowing down a little bit extra and thinking about the way that you're using purpose. So I'll give you a few minutes. I'll tell you all 4 of these answers and why they are correct in a few minutes. Give you one more minute in case you're still working on a couple of those. I'll go over in a minute. So on the first one, it asks what type of writing this passage is reflective of. Your thought process should have told you informative. So they're informing you about how the skin colors of snakes relate to whether they are poisonous or not. So since informative is not there, that would make it an expository. So one should be choice B, expository. Number 2 is skin colors and markings have an important role to play in the world of snakes. This would be the main idea. We talk a lot more about the difference in these 4 things in reading 1 class, so we won't go too much into them. Do change anything you see in this packet that says supporting idea, change it to detail. This is a third-party source. I'm not fond of this source whatsoever. They just happen to have a couple of reading passages that work. You will see things pulled into my reading packets from sources that I don't like and don't recommend, and I only pull the things that actually work correctly for what I want. So change that idea to detail so that it's not confusing you when you go to look at that later. The reason that that's a main idea, the thing that I would recommend most is don't worry about where they say it is. So one of the big tricks of the reading test is they'll say the sentence appears and then they'll say some location. And a lot of times what I've noticed in my students is if it's not in the location that they're thinking it should be in, if it's the main idea, they won't pick main idea because of where they said it was located. Where they said it was located would be a second priority to what it actually says. So I encourage you to really read the wording and decide for yourself, regardless of where it's actually located. Is that the main idea? Is it? And remember that the main idea is the whole point. So is the whole point of this entire thing the fact that skin colors and markings have an important role to play in the world of snakes? Yes, that is the point. Topic would be much more broad. So the topic would be something like snakes. A theme would not be this specific. It would either be a recurring word or it would be something that gets alluded to but not said. We talk about those a lot in reading 1. And then a supporting detail would be word for word, but would just be a supporting detail. It would not encompass the main idea. Number 3 is which of the following conclusions may be drawn directly from the second paragraph of the passage. Conclusions is reading class 3, so we won't put a lot of emphasis on that as well because it's from reading 3. One thing to notice, whether it's reading 3 or any other reading class, is it says second paragraph, and it doesn't matter what the question asks. If they ask you to base it on one particular paragraph, you want to make really sure that that's what you're doing, that you're basing it just on that one specific paragraph. So we only want to factor in the second paragraph in the way that we're going to answer this question. The answer to this one is B. So it's a reasonable conclusion to say that the coral snake and king snake have the same markings. They look the same. The coral snake is poisonous. The king snake isn't. And they describe the fact that the coral snake is colored the way it is to tell its predators that it's a coral snake, and that if they eat it, they'll die because they'll get the venom that the snake has. So it essentially protects the coral snake from being eaten, and it also protects the predator from eating a poisonous snake, which will kill the predator. The king snake, on the other hand, has the same markings, but not for that reason. The reason that the king snake has the markings is to prevent being eaten by predators, because the predator can't tell if it's a coral or a king snake, and it's not worth the risk to the hawk or the eagle or whatever it is that it might be a poisonous snake. So that allows us to say they must be hunted by the same predators if having the same markings will prevent the king snake from getting eaten. The king snake is not dangerous to humans in A. That would be backwards. The coral snake is the one that is. It's safe to handle snakes in the woods because you can easily tell whether or not they're poisonous. That's, again, exactly the opposite of what they said. They said that two of them look the same and one of them's poisonous and the other's not. So that would say you can't tell by looking. The king snake does not change its marking when hawks or eagles are close by. I see this answer a lot, and I think it's more of not paying attention to the detail of the answer than anything else. But they definitely didn't say that this is a snake that has the ability to just spontaneously change what it looks like. So B and D kind of are along the same lines, but when you read them carefully, D is not true and B is. And then there's one more purpose question, which says, which of the following is the author's main purpose for writing this passage? So the main purpose is going to be A. Now there's a couple of observations to notice here. So to explain how the markings on a snake are related to whether it's venomous, we want to be doing a purpose where we're actually describing the author's purpose. We want to do that based on the description. So we want to be descriptive. We want to get the right description. So it's not to teach them the differences between coral and king snakes, because we didn't focus on their differences. We only looked at one of their differences, but we were talking about the fact that they look the same. So that would not be a good main purpose. There might have been a tiny bit of discussion of some of the elements that you'll see as choices here, but it has to be the main purpose. To illustrate why snakes are dangerous is definitely not the main purpose. And to demonstrate how animals survive in difficult environments is also not the main purpose. That would mean that the entire article was about animals in general, and it couldn't be so zoomed in order to work for that answer. The other thing that you will notice, we did say it was expository before, and our answer has to explain with it. It won't always match perfectly, but usually it does. So like to teach, to illustrate, and to demonstrate are not actual passage types. So barring a couple of exceptions, you won't end up answering something that's got a tagline that's wrong, unless that's the only thing that's even remotely close to being the right description, in which case very occasionally you might see that. So always look to make sure that the tagline at the beginning of the descriptive one matches closely to the tagline for the regular purpose, for the style purpose. Go ahead and read the next article. The next article is a little bit longer and it's a little bit tricky. I believe there's there's 3 questions about this one. So it is the one that says note, and it talks about the instructor of a history class and then shows a letter that he wrote to his students. And then it's got the 1, 2, 3. And then there's 3 questions about it. So I'll give you a little bit more time because this is definitely longer than the one that you just looked at. So we will take a look at those in a few minutes. Give you 1 more minute and I will go over these ones. So the first question, 44, says, which of the following describes this type of writing? This one is considered a technical. So the main purpose of this one is to provide the instructions as to how you would execute the different options that you have available. So the main purpose is going to be technical. Again, it's not really informing us of anything except for a process that we can follow, but that would fall into the technical category. So the only thing that makes that a little bit confusing is up here. This is kind of more descriptive and seems a little bit more like it's in the style of an informative, but they really don't inform us of anything. This is obviously something with a limited audience, which is people that are in this particular class. And the main purpose is the 1, 2, 3 that are included in there. So that one will be technical. Which of the following describes the instructor's purpose in writing this email to his students? The purpose is C, which says to give students the opportunity to make up the bad score and avoid failing the course. Again, main purpose. This letter would not have been written if it weren't for the opportunity to do something to change your grade. So he doesn't really berate the students for the poor scores. He acknowledges the poor scores and kind of says, like, if you're not worried, you should be. But that is not his purpose. He wouldn't have written this if he was just going to say you guys didn't score well. He didn't really encourage students to continue working hard in spite of failure. And even if you interpreted it as he did that, he definitely wasn't mainly setting out to encourage them that even though they failed, they should keep working. It was to give them a specific type of opportunity. Even if he did, I don't think he really admitted that the essay exam was too hard. He just said it was too hard for that particular class. Even if he did admit that, though, again, you have to make sure you're really thinking about the main purpose why he did this. He would not have written this if it weren't to give the opportunity. The next answer will go very similarly hand in hand with that. So which of the following offers the best summary for the instructor's motive in sending the email to the students? This time it's an actual quote from the work itself that you're picking out. So it's the same question as the last question, but it's asking you to pick out a sentence that they used. And that would be, with each class comes a new challenge. However, and as any good instructor will tell you, sometimes the original plan has to change. So that winds up being the purpose. So the plan has to change, therefore, here's your opportunity to change your grade. The next passage is 3 paragraphs, and there's several questions about it. There's a lot of really interesting perspective questions that are not so much purpose, but we don't really run into them anywhere else as well. So try these out. Some of these are really interesting. The recommendation that I'll make up front is make sure you're really careful about where you're sort of standing as you're answering the questions. So make sure that you kind of analyze whose perspective you would be standing in as you're answering each of these questions, and your perspective will change a little bit between like a reader of certain types or the writer of the author, and so on. So try those 3 paragraphs. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions. So I'll give you a minute to do those. We will go over those in a few. So 47 asks for the main idea of the passage. Of course, we go more into main idea in reading 1. So the main idea of this one is that earning money is much less difficult than managing it properly, and that's choice B. 48 says, what would this author's attitude likely be to a person unable to find employment? So this is kind of a perspective switch where we're looking from the perspective of the person who can't find employment reading this. What would they think of the author is the question. They would think that the author is incredulous. Incredulous, by the way, is one of the words you could actually be asked to define on the English test. And it essentially would boil down, if you thought of it really simply, to not credible. So an incredulous is someone who's hard to believe, who's not credible. And that would be how this person would consider the author, because they make it sound like getting a job and making money are easy. It's managing money that's hard. According to the author, what is more difficult than making money? So that's a reiteration of the main idea. It's more difficult to manage it. And then who is the most likely audience for this passage? So when we think about audience, that does have quite a bit to do with purpose. And it's going to be general readers. So basically, economists is like the writer. So they're not writing it to their colleagues who are of the same level of economic understanding that they are. They're writing it to people who aren't of that level of economic understanding. However, we don't have any info that would tell us that it's specifically teachers or philanthropists or any other specific occupation, because they're not aiming it at any particular type of person other than just not being someone who is an economist or a professional at money managing. The best definition of economy as it's used in the passage is the traditional definition of it, which is the exchange of money, goods, and services. Which word best describes the author's attitude towards those who believe they understand money? So this is the author and what they would think of someone who thinks that they understand money. Their attitude toward them would be patronizing. Patronizing is similar sort of to condescending. Even if you didn't know what patronizing exactly was, supportive, incriminating, and excessive, none of those really fit the context of how we're using the word and or what the word means. This passage is most likely taken from this is going to be self-help manual. I don't feel like it seems like something that's from a self-help manual because it's written by an economist, but it's definitely not an autobiography. That's a story someone writes about themselves and their life. An epistle is like a academic source, like a research source, so it's definitely not that. And then a novel would be a story, so it's definitely not that. So of all of them, managing money would be at least synonymous with self-help, although it just doesn't come across like it's in the manual. You will find situations like that. Let's see what else we have coming. Let's skip one page. So you're going to skip this one that says they were known as the 5 and go on to the next one where you will see a memo to employees. This will be the last one that we do together. You can backtrack and do that one right before this, and then you can move forward and do the few articles that are left after this as well. Once you've completed this packet, you can let me know so that I can send you the key. So you will go on to finish and practice after we get done with this last one. So I'll give you a few minutes to do this little memo and the 2 questions that go with it. So the answer to the first question, what is the human resources manager's intent in the memo? It's to inform, which is choice C, and it's to inform of the consequences that may happen. So it's to inform of a situation that's occurring and of what the possible consequences may be. And then, which of the following explains the reason for the parenthetical note about the employees labeling their food items? So the parenthetical note says, as a quick reminder, we encourage those who bring food items to label those items. That would be choice B, which says the labeling ensures that the company will know whether or not an employee is removing his or her own item. That's not the best answer. It's not really what you would think it would be. But if you look at the other options, they're a lot worse than this one. The labeling represents a kind of courtesy to the other employees to show which items belong to who. It's not a courtesy, and it's definitely not a courtesy to other employees. The labeling represents a rule for employees who bring food, and the company can terminate employees that do not leave or label food items. Well, they're saying it's an encouragement, not a rule, so that won't work. The last one says that they'll ensure that people are eating lunch, which is also not going to be accurate because they're not necessarily trying to enforce eating. They're trying to enforce labeling your items and taking your own items. So that is it for reading 2. You have 7 more pages of this packet that you can work on, as well as you have that 1 page to go backward to. When you're fully done with the passages, let me know so that I can send you a key. I don't send them out until you're 100% done with them. I have ratios and proportions class next. I'm sending out the link right when we hang up here. And if you're in that class, I will see you in a minute. Otherwise, I will see you later. Thanks.